Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I want to talk about the importance of the brand new $500. Let's go all the way through. The brand new $500 6,000 piece 21 minifig Lego Lord of the Rings Rivendell set. The importance of the Legos Lord of the Rings Rivendell sets for Dungeons & Dragons community. All right. So I have a question for you, okay? That question is, why was the $500 6,000 piece 21 Lego minifig Lord of the Rings Rivendell set released in H1 of 2023? All right, let's answer that question. All right, my posit is the reason that Lego chose to release the Rivendell set, the most extensive Lord of the Rings set that has ever been created, is because Lego now has a quality standard which has been imposed on it by Dungeons & Dragons, and an array of American fantasy needs that Lego must meet in order to fulfill their delivery, their expected delivery for the Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Masters and Dungeons & Dragons players who will be arriving at Lego specifically with the expected purpose of using Legos to establish a new quality standard for miniatures and terrain. Okay? All right. So what I'm saying is that, in my humble opinion, the Lord of the Rings Rivendell set was delivered in H1 of 2023 for the specific express purpose of fulfilling the expected demands of arriving Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Masters and players to Lego. All right. So last year in 2022, Lego said, after many decades, we are officially connecting ourselves to Dungeons & Dragons, right? And they announced the brand new Dungeons & Dragons set, right? And there was determination of exactly which set would be used for Dungeons & Dragons. And it was very clear, like, there was a decision, right? And they were like, we could make a Lego Mimic, right? But if they made a Lego Mimic, it would have been at a scale of like 1/4 of an actual Mimic, or maybe 1/16 of an actual Mimic, and there would have been no Lego minifigs. But instead, when they actually chose the specific official Dungeons & Dragons set that would be the first Lego official Dungeons & Dragons set, they made sure that it had a monster, that it had perfectly scaled minifig scale miniatures that can be used in Dungeons & Dragons, that it had terrain, that it had treasure, that it represented spell use, that every aspect of Dungeons & Dragons was actually properly delivered, so that, in my humble opinion, it could replace the current highest quality standard of Dungeons & Dragons terrain and miniatures, which is WizKids' official product, right? And I think Dungeons & Dragons is now pointing players and dungeon masters to replace as the highest tier of quality. And I want to be clear, Dungeons & Dragons wants to make sure that there's lots of quality standards, right? So tier 2 quality, you would still use the still printed WizKids miniatures and terrain. But if you want the highest quality standard, right, for terrain, for monsters, and for miniatures for Dungeons & Dragons, you will be switching to Lego, right? And once these two companies merged their two products, and Legos was saying, hey, look, here is this official Dungeons and Dragons Lego set with official Dungeons and Dragons characters, right? And we're telling you that you can represent your player characters with minis right now. You can go over and use the full arrayed, colored, monocolor Everyone is Awesome sets, or you can use Lego Castles, which has been around for decades, but this is the new Tier 1 highest standard of quality for Dungeons & Dragons miniatures, terrains, and monsters, right? And so Lego connected itself to Dungeons & Dragons, and that's a good question. Why did Lego connect itself to Dungeons & Dragons? Well, it absolutely needs Dungeons & Dragons, and the reason why is, what do you do with Legos, right? You put them together and you stick them on a wall. You don't do anything with them, right? But the reality is, I think when Lego started talking to Hasbro, they were like, oh my gosh, we have 1 million worlds. We have Star Wars and Avatar and Marvel, but people just build them and then they stick them on a wall. But you guys have a powerful engine that's already connected to Marvel through the planar gate, right? Through the secret layers drop, through Dominaria, right? So you guys have already connected your worlds to IPs we already have. Lots of them, right? And you guys have a Lord of the Rings, Magic, and not only are you, and you Dungeons & Dragons are not just going to connect your world through our Lego minifigs section and use for terrain and monsters and minifigs, you're also connecting it directly up to Dominaria through the Lord of the Rings, Dominaria, Arcavios, Strixhaven, World Strand, right? All of this is connected. And so the moment Lego realized, holy cows, people can tell stories with the specific miniatures, terrain, and monsters we've already been creating for decades, right? 7 decades, I believe. I think Lego is like 70 years old, 20 years older than Dungeons & Dragons. I think they got incredibly excited, right? And so now, right, now that Lego is saying, okay, we are connecting our worlds to Dungeons & Dragons, and we're going to hand you, like, within like another month or two, right, we're going to hand you your first D&D minifigs, and you'll have your first monsters, your first terrains. But the reality is, we understand you guys start using this stuff way before it hits commercial product. So the reality is, when it hits, Rivendell is going to supply literally river parts, forest parts, trees. It's going to allow you to model out cityscapes, gazebos, right? It's also going to be able to, you'll be able to fully model out inns, like literally every American fantasy standard that you use in Dungeons & Dragons, it's all in Rivendell, right? 25-minute minifigs so that literally every single class will have the right weapons, and all of the weapons will be spread across humans, dwarves, and elves. Every major core species in Dungeons & Dragons is covered in Rivendell, right? And there's going to be weapon racks, and there's going to be roofs and doors and tiles and axes and swords and bows, and you will be able to model human spaces, dwarf spaces, and elf spaces, all with just the material from Rivendell. And you'll be able, and since it's so huge, you'll be able to set up literally every single building and every single game space, every terrain space you will need for an entire adventure, an entire session. You will have to break them apart between sessions and rebuild, but they're also pointing and saying, hey, we have additional sets, right? And so the reality is, I think Rivendell is the most extensive American fantasy set that they have ever produced. It far surpasses anything that was ever released under the Lego Castle, right? And they're like, hey, we have literally thousands, right? Maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe low millions of dungeon masters and players arriving and saying, we don't need these WizKids minis anymore. Nobody needs Reaper Bones anymore. Dwarven Forge is completely unnecessary. We have a far better, scalable, customizable. The actual minifigs and the terrain and the monsters are as customizable in the miniature terrain monster sets of Lego, right, as the actual Dungeons & Dragons game. And so Dungeons & Dragons gets a new terrain set, a new miniature set, a new monster set that is customizable exactly like Dungeons & Dragons. And Lego gets literally, literally 1,000 worlds, right? They're like, oh man, these don't have to be created and then shoved on a shelf. These can actually be used for as storytelling narrative tools, right? And that's a huge leap for Lego, because it says you can do something with your Legos, right? You don't just build them, shove them on a shelf, and then break them apart, right? They are a part of a living narrative system, right? And that's a huge, huge advantage for Lego. So that is why I think Rivendell is really the most ultimate beginner set for Dungeon Masters and D&D players to say we can model out literally every base class, every base species in the PHB. It's all here. We have everything we need, right? We have terrain, we have monsters, and we have miniatures. And it is incredibly beneficial on both sides, which is really, really exciting. So I believe that Rivendell was created to meet the expectation and demand of arriving D&D players and Dungeon Masters to the new Tier 1 quality standard that's been set on the D&D side and set on the Lego side for narrative. Every single word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.